All right, so welcome to the deep dive. And we always say we take what you're kind of already into the articles, the research, the deep dives you find fascinating. We try to like extract the, core insights from those things.
Yeah, totally.
So you sent us a pretty hefty one this time. Um, a critical review over 3,500 words of the film What Dreams May Come. The one from 1998, based on Richard Matheson's novel.
Right.
I mean, that's a seriously long review. That kind of tells you right off the bat that this isn't, just some simple, lighthearted story. We're dealing with some serious depth here.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, a review that long, it's got to be grappling with some pretty big ideas, something that really stuck with the person writing it. It speaks to the film's ambition for sure, that it could inspire that kind of deep analysis.
So that's our mission today, to sort of navigate through this in-depth review and like really try to understand what makes this film so powerful. Why does the story about grief, love, and the afterlife, resonate so strongly with people? What is it about this film that connects with us on like an emotional level, but also on an intellectual level? I think we should start with just the heart of the story. Like, for those who haven't seen it in a while or maybe never saw it, what's the central narrative here?
Well, at its core, What Dreams May Come is about Chris Nielsen.
Mm.
He's a pediatrician, and his wife, Annie, who was an artist.
Mm-hmm.
And their lives are just completely shattered when they lose their two children in a car accident.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And the review really emphasizes how this just devastates Annie.
Hmm.
It sends her into really deep depression. And then, to make matters even worse, Chris himself dies in a separate car accident.
Oh, my gosh. So it's like a double tragedy.
Yeah, exactly. It's just one thing after another.
So Chris passes away, and this is where I feel like the film really takes a turn into this like very unique visual territory.
Oh, absolutely. The review describes how Chris arrives in this version of heaven, but it's not, your typical pearly gates and clouds kind of heaven.
Right, right.
It's something else entirely.
Right.
It's this incredibly personal heaven shaped by his wife Annie's imagination and her artistic style. So picture these landscapes that look like living oil paintings, bursting with these really vivid colors and textures, all inspired by her art. It's a beautiful and intimate space that directly reflects their shared love and her inner world.
Wow, it's like stepping inside of one of her paintings.
Exactly.
Uh-huh.
And what's really fascinating is how this suggests that, our connections and the things we love can actually shape our reality, even beyond life.
That's heavy stuff. But this piece doesn't last forever, right? The review mentions that there's a pretty dark turn in the narrative.
Yeah, unfortunately, Chris finds out that Annie, he completely heartbroken by the loss of her children and now him, has taken her own life.
Oh.
And according to the film's own rules about the afterlife, this act tragically leads her to a personal hell. The review makes it really clear, though, this isn't the traditional fire and brimstone kind of hell. We're talking about intense psychological suffering born from her own pain, guilt, and grief. It really drives home the idea that our internal struggles can manifest in our eternal experience. In a way, our hell is what we make it.
Wow. So she's trapped in this self-created hell, rooted in her suffering. And Chris, driven by his love for Annie, he's not going to just let her stay there. This is where the review brings up those parallels to Orpheus and Eurydice, right? That whole journey to the underworld to rescue someone you love.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
That's the connection the review makes. Chris's unwavering determination to go into this personal hell to save Annie. It mirrors those classic stories of love conquering death. And it's not just those myths. There are even hints of Dante's Inferno in there. The review points that out too. It taps into this deep well of, human storytelling, this idea of one soul braving anything, even the ultimate darkness to save another. It makes you think about how strong those connections can be.
Absolutely. So let's pull back a little bit. What are like the central themes that the film really tackles, according to this review? What are the big ideas that stand out?
Well, the review points to a few key themes. First and foremost, it's the eternal nature of love. This idea that love can transcend death itself, and that there's this bond between soulmates that can't be broken, even by something as final as death. It also dives into the nature of suffering, both in our lives and in this version of the afterlife that the film creates.
Yeah.
And ultimately, it emphasizes the redemptive power of love, this idea that even in the darkest of places, love can be the key to healing and salvation.
It's a powerful message. And this whole concept of heaven and hell, not as actual places, but as reflections of our internal states, that really struck me as something unique. What do you think about that?
I think it's a fascinating idea. The film really leans into the idea that heaven and hell are not physical locations, but rather manifestations of who we are on the inside. They're shaped by our experiences, our memories, beliefs, traumas, and desires. The review uses the term metaphysical elasticity to describe this. It highlights that, these afterlives aren't these fixed, unchanging places. They're fluid and dynamic extensions of our psychological and emotional landscapes. Just like if our internal world became our external reality, it really makes you think about what your own personal heaven or hell would look like.
It's a pretty wild thought experiment, for
Oh.
sure. Now, beyond all these profound themes, the film is also known for its amazing visuals. You mentioned this painterly heaven before, and based on how the review describes it, can you help us really visualize that?
Oh yeah, the review really goes all out in describing the visuals. It's like stepping into a world where everything's made of brushstrokes, where landscapes look like they were painted with thick, vibrant oils. The colors are so rich and saturated, the textures feel almost tangible. The review even talks about how Chris walks through fields and leaves trails of color behind him like he's disturbing wet paint. Even the flowers have this hyperreal painted quality, and the sky is filled with these swirling, dreamlike hues. It's all incredibly immersive.
It sounds like a visual feast, but it's more than just pretty pictures, right? The review suggests there's a deeper meaning behind all this. What's the symbolism at play with this painterly heaven?
Exactly. The review argues that the visual style isn't just random. It's meant to directly represent emotional memory and the depth of Chris's love for Annie. It's Annie's inner world, her artistic soul, literally being brought to life through Chris's love. And those painted textures, they actually become a metaphor for subjectivity. Heaven isn't presented as this objective, universal reality. It's deeply personal, fluid, and impressionistic, like a painting itself. It makes you think about how many our own perspectives actually shape the reality we experience.
Wow, that's deep. And then you have this stark contrast with hell. I'm guessing it's not exactly filled with those same vibrant colors.
Not quite. The review describes it as being very stark, brutal, and fragmented. It evokes this sense of psychological horror more than anything else. There are images of tormented souls trapped in the earth reaching out in anguish. But the key point the review makes is that the real torment isn't physical. It comes from this profound sense of isolation, the crushing weight of regret, the inability to forgive oneself. The review even compares it to the nightmarish visions of Hieronymus Bosch, that painter known for his really disturbing imagery. It really reinforces the idea that we can create our own personal hells through our own internal struggles.
Right, so the visuals, they're directly tied to the film's themes. Heaven represents connection and love and these beautiful memories, while hell represents isolation and self-punishment. It's really powerful imagery. Now, given all this emotionally intense stuff, the performances must be really key. What does the review say about Robin Williams and Annabella Sciorra and how they portray these characters?
The review has particularly high praise for Robin Williams. It points out how nuanced and vulnerable his performance is. He steps away from his usual comedic persona and portrays Chris with his quiet strength and deep compassion. His interactions with his family, both before and after death, they're described as really tender and genuine, which makes this whole fantastical journey feel grounded and relatable. The review even ranks this performance up there with his work in Dead Poet Society and Good Will Hunting as a prime example of his dramatic range.
So it's not just Robin Williams being funny.
Not at all. This is Robin Williams at his most emotionally raw and powerful.
And how about Annabella Sciorra as Annie? The reviews seem to suggest that she was more than just a character for Chris to save.
Right, the review really praises Sciorra's performance. It highlights how she's able to capture this full range of emotions. Annie's initial vibrancy as an artist, the devastating grief she experiences after losing her children, and then the utter despair that leads her to take her own life. She's really portrayed as the emotional core of the film, the one we empathize with most deeply, which in turn makes Chris's determination to save her all the more powerful and heartbreaking. Her performance really underscores just how destructive grief and despair can be if they're not addressed.
It sounds like a really demanding role. The review also mentioned Cuba Gooding Jr. and Max von Sydow. I'm curious, what roles did they play in this, and what did the review have to say about their performances?
Yeah, so Cuba Gooding Jr. plays Albert, who's this guide in the afterlife. He's kind of like a spiritual mentor for Chris at first. The review mentions his warm and energetic presence, but also hints at a deeper connection to Chris that's revealed later on. It adds some complexity to his character and his unwavering loyalty. And then you have Max von Sydow. He plays the tracker, who's kind of like Virgil in Dante's Inferno. He accompanies Chris on his descent into hell. His performance is described as very restrained, but powerful. It lends a certain gravitas and philosophical weight to those darker scenes.
It's interesting how the film blends those mythological and literary references. Now, moving beyond the narrative and the visuals, the review really digs into the philosophical side of what dreams may come. It seems like the film draws from a pretty wide range of spiritual and psychological ideas.
Oh yeah, definitely. The review describes the film's vision of the afterlife as syncretic, which means it draws inspiration from various sources. You got elements of Buddhism, Christianity, New Age spirituality, even some Jungian psychology in there, which emphasizes the unconscious mind and archetypes. But the main through line is this idea that consciousness survives death, and our experience in the afterlife is directly shaped by our internal state. It's a fascinating blend of different traditions, which speaks to our universal fascination with what happens after we die.
Right, it's like a melting pot of different beliefs. So this concept of heaven and hell as extensions of our thoughts, can you unpack that a bit more? What does the review say about that specifically?
So the film basically presents this universe where people are drawn to afterlives that mirror their internal realities. It's both empowering and a bit daunting in a way because it suggests we have a certain degree of control over our eternal fate, but it also emphasizes personal responsibility. If heaven and hell are products of our own minds, then we have to be accountable for what we create. In this context, suicide isn't seen as a sin that's punished by some external force. It's presented as a consequence of the soul's inability to escape its own suffering, its own self-blame. It's a really nuanced perspective on a really sensitive topic.
Yeah, it is. And it's interesting how the film handles Annie's suicide. It frames her despair as this deep sorrow rather than a moral failing. The reviews seem to appreciate that sensitivity.
Definitely. The review commends the film for its compassionate approach to mental health. It doesn't try to judge Annie's actions, but instead focuses on the depth of her pain and the idea that even from that kind of despair, redemption is still possible.
Now, the review also touched upon the technical aspects of the film, the editing, the score, the pacing. How do those elements contribute to the overall impact?
Well, the review points out how the film's editing is very deliberate and contemplative.
Yeah.
It lets these stunning visuals really linger on screen and allows the emotional weight of each scene to kind of sink in. The pacing is described as intentionally slow, which might not be for everyone, but it definitely suits the film's introspective and meditative tone. And then you have Michael Kammen's score, which is really powerful. It's this blend of sweeping orchestral melodies and more melancholic themes that really amplify the grandeur of the afterlife and the sorrow of the story. It does a great job of guiding your emotions without feeling manipulative.
It sounds like it's a very intentional and carefully crafted film. Now, even with all that ambition and those amazing visuals, the review mentions that the film wasn't universally praised when it first came out. Why is that? What were some of the criticisms?
Well, some critics found the film to be a little too sentimental or emotionally manipulative. They felt like it was trying a bit too hard to tug at your heartstrings. Others, while acknowledging the incredible visuals, felt that the story itself wasn't always as strong or as coherent as it could have been. The review acknowledges these criticisms and even points out that the film does sometimes walk a fine line between genuine emotional resonance and melodrama.
Yep.
It's a film that definitely goes for it emotionally, and that can be a bit much for some people.
Sure, I can see that. But even with those criticisms, the film has gained a pretty dedicated following over the years, hasn't it? What does the review say about that?
Yeah, absolutely. The review mentioned how What Dreams May Come has developed this kind of cult following, particularly among those who are drawn to films that explore spiritual and philosophical themes. It's a film that really tries to grapple with these big questions about life, death, and what it all means, and that resonates with a lot of people. It's also just a visually stunning and unique film that stands out from the crowd. And of course, we can't forget about that Oscar win for Best Visual Effects. Even decades later, those effects still hold up, and the review really emphasizes how creative and emotionally resonant they are.
Yeah, that's a big deal. Those effects weren't just there for spectacle. They were integral to the storytelling.
Exactly. They weren't just about being flashy. They were about reflecting the inner lives of the characters and bringing those emotions to life on screen. And the review concludes by saying that What Dreams May Come is a really important film in Robin Williams' filmography. It showcases his range as an actor and his ability to portray deep vulnerability and emotion. It's a reminder that he was so much more than just a comedic genius.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up this deep dive into this review, what do you think are the most important things to take away from What Dreams May Come?
Well, I think the review highlights a few key takeaways. First, it's a film that explores the power of love and its ability to transcend even death. It suggests that the bonds we create in life can have meaning and impact even in the afterlife. Second, it presents this really compelling concept of personalized afterlives that are shaped by our own thoughts and emotions. It's a thought-provoking idea that challenges us to consider what our own internal landscape might create. The film's visual metaphors are also incredibly powerful, and they really enhance those themes. And finally, the performances, particularly Robin Williams and Annabella Sciorra, are incredibly moving. They ground the film in this raw human emotion that makes it all the more impactful.
It sounds like it's a film that really stays with you, and ultimately it's a film that tackles some really big philosophical questions about life, death, grief, redemption, and the nature of reality itself. And it all started with this deep dive into the review that you sent us.
It did.
Yeah,
It's amazing how a single piece of writing can spark such a profound exploration.
absolutely. And that brings us to our final thought for you. Considering how What Dreams May Come portrays heaven and hell as these personal extensions of ourselves, what aspects of your own inner world do you find most compelling or maybe even challenging to explore? What would your personal heaven or hell look like if it were shaped by your consciousness, your memories, your beliefs, your art? It's a question worth pondering, I think. Thanks for joining us. Ever find yourself completely mesmerized by a film's visuals? You know, those movies that are just so visually stunning that you can't help but wonder how they did it.
Oh, absolutely. There are some films that just transport you to another world.
Right. Well, today we're taking a deep dive into the making of one of those films, the 1998 film, What Dreams May Come.
Ooh, that's a great one. A very visually ambitious film.
It really is. And for our listeners who, like us, love to understand the how and the why behind these cinematic feats, we're going to be uncovering some really fascinating insights from a piece we found called Five Film Curiosities.
Okay, color me intrigued. What are we diving into specifically?
Well, our mission today is to kind of take apart the magic behind those visuals, you know? How did they blend classic art and cutting-edge technology to create that unique look?
Right.
And why did it resonate so strongly with audiences? I mean, the film even snagged an Oscar for its visual effects.
And deservedly so. I mean, the film's entire visual design was inspired by painting styles, if I recall.
Yeah, that's right. Particularly Impressionism. That painted world of heaven wasn't just like a pretty backdrop. It was really central to the whole feel of the story.
Absolutely. It created a visual language that spoke to the emotional journey of the characters.
So let's talk about this painted world because it wasn't just a simple digital effect, right?
Right.
Our source mentions a mix of practical effects, digital compositing, and even oil-based textures. I mean, how did they even use oil paints in a film?
Well, think of it like this. They were really pushing boundaries. They would project actual textures from oil paintings onto surfaces, and then incorporate those textures into the digital rendering process. So you're adding this subtle, almost tactile element to the visual.
So it's almost like you can feel the brush strokes on the screen. That's incredible.
Exactly. It's that kind of detail that gave the film that dreamlike, ethereal quality, which you wouldn't get with a purely digital, crisp look.
And I imagine that was pretty groundbreaking for 1998.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
They were really pioneers in using those techniques to achieve that painterly aesthetic.
And the Academy clearly took notice, right? They gave the film the Oscar for Best Visual Effects in 1999,
That's right.
which is even more impressive when you consider it was up against some pretty big sci-fi films that year.
You know what's fascinating about that is that it really highlights how the Academy recognized the artistic merit and emotional impact of the visuals. They weren't just impressed by technical wizardry. This was about how those visuals served the story.
Right, and I think that gets to the heart of why this film resonated so deeply with people.
Absolutely. The painted world wasn't just a spectacle. It was a reflection of the characters' inner lives.
Exactly. And to create those incredible painted landscapes, they actually relied heavily on blue and green screen technology.
Yeah, I remember reading that.
Over 85% of the film was shot using those techniques, especially for the heaven and hell scenes. Which is wild when you think about it. For a drama so focused on really intense emotions, that level of visual effects was pretty unusual.
It was incredibly forward-thinking for the time. You know, usually that kind of heavy digital compositing was reserved for big action or sci-fi films. So for a film like What Dreams May Come to use it so extensively and so effectively, it really was a game changer.
And it really opened up the possibilities for using visual effects to tell more introspective, character-driven stories, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It showed that visual effects could be just as powerful in a quiet, emotional drama as they could be in a big, explosive blockbuster.
Right. And speaking of emotional impact, the source also mentioned Robin Williams' personal connection to the film. The themes of love and loss that run throughout the story, I mean, they really resonated with him on a deep level.
It's impossible to ignore that, right?
Yeah.
Especially knowing his later struggles. It adds another layer of meaning to his performance. and how he embodied that emotional landscape that the visuals were trying to create.
Yeah, definitely. And it just goes to show how visual storytelling, when it's done right, can really enhance the emotional depth of a film.
Right. It's not just about creating a spectacle. It's about using visuals to connect with the audience on an emotional level. And that's exactly what Dreams May Come did so brilliantly.
It really did. And I think it's also interesting to note that while they were building these fantastical digital realms for the film, they also grounded parts of it in reality.
Oh, yeah, they used real locations in New Zealand and California for some of the landscape shots,
Exactly. So you have this really fascinating contrast between the real and the hyper-real.
which I think makes those otherworldly elements even more striking.
Right. Because you have this foundation in something tangible, something recognizable, and then you layer on these incredible digital effects.
Exactly. They weren't afraid to let the beauty of the natural world shine through, which I think really adds to the overall impact of the film.
So let's do a quick recap for our listeners.
Sounds good.
We've talked about how What Dreams May Come really pushed the boundaries of visual storytelling, blending classic artistic inspiration with cutting-edge visual effects.
And how that innovative approach earned the film a well-deserved Oscar.
Right. We also touched on the sheer scale of the digital work involved, which was pretty groundbreaking for an emotional drama at the time.
And of course, we talked about Robin Williams' deep personal connection to the film's themes and how that connection really shines through in his performance.
Absolutely. And we can't forget about the clever way the filmmakers used real-world locations to ground those fantastical digital environments, creating this really beautiful balance between the real and the unreal.
It's a technique we see echoed in a lot of films today.
Definitely. So all of this has us thinking, how has What Dreams May Come's artistic approach influenced filmmaking in the years since it was released?
That's a good question.
And what other unexpected sources, maybe beyond the realm of classic art, might hold the key to inspiring the captivating cinematic worlds of the future?
That's something for our listeners to ponder.
It is, and we'd love to hear your thoughts.
Absolutely.
That wraps up our deep dive into the making of What Dreams May Come.
Until next time.
See you.